you guys, welcome back to Flickers of Fear, my movie review show. So it's February, and if you saw my last movie review, which I think was Irreversible, I said that for the month of February, I was going to actually do a theme. I might not do that every month because it seems like kind of a pain in the ass, but to be honest, I have such a huge backlog of movies that I want to watch or rewatch and review that sometimes it's easier for me to kind of have a theme for the month, so at least I know like which ones to watch and which ones to pick. And because, and I've brought this up on a bunch of my previous shows, Shudder just added a documentary about folk horror, which is really, really good. And watching that kind of got me, you know, interested in a lot of movies on there that I hadn't seen before. So I decided for February I was going to do some folk horror movies, new ones and old ones. Now this movie here, I don't know if it's the first thing you'd think of when you think folk horror, although it does have a lot of folk horror elements in it. Now I actually saw this movie back in 2017 or early 2018, and I loved it, and I wrote about it on my blog, and ever since then I've been thinking about it and thinking, oh man, I really need to rewatch that and review it for the show, because it's one that's really pretty much universally acclaimed and loved. So I figured, since it does have folk horror elements, I decided that this would be a good time to do it. And the movie that I'm talking about is The Wailing from 2016. Now, this was the third film directed by Na Hong-jin. I have not seen his other two, which I think are called The Chaser and The Yellow Sea, I believe. This is a South Korean film. The South Korean title is Gokseong, which I think is also the name of the village where the movie takes place. This movie... it's crazy. I mean, South Korean cinema, South Korean horror cinema, South Korean action cinema. I mean, we just talked about I Saw the Devil not too long ago, which not exactly a horror movie, but it does have a lot of horror movie elements to it. And I think, South Korean horror and revenge cinema are really kind of operating on a different level, and I mean that in the most complimentary way possible, because honestly some of the more recent films, I'm talking maybe like last 10-15 years out of South Korea that I've seen, they've all been fucking dynamite. Just amazing films, and I'm talking about The Wailing, The Host, Train to Busan. There's just so many fucking good ones. I Saw the Devil. And I'm not entirely... I guess it's because, I don't know, they're just willing to take, and this movie in particular is really willing to play with genre and tone, and is willing to kind of like take its time and not do what you would expect. This is a very ballsy movie in the sense that I really can't see an American filmmaker attempting this, and if they did attempt it, it might not go too well, because this movie, I'm not even entirely sure what genre I would call it. It's almost kind of like, it starts out as like almost like a police procedural, but with horror comedy elements, and I know that sounds bizarre, but actually the first part of it is actually kind of funny, but there's also like grim shit going on too, but it's not exactly played for laughs, but there is kind of a lot of comedy in there. And then as the movie goes on, it kind of turns into like a mystery, and then there's kind of all this other like way hardcore like supernatural horror elements to it later on. It's almost kind of like, and this might be sort of like a glib thing to say, but it almost seems like, if you guys have seen the other Korean movie, which is fucking great, Memories of Murder, it's kind of like that, but with The Exorcist kind of, and then like a folk horror kind of thing, and then like some funny shit in it. It's kind of all over the place, but I don't mean that in a bad way. Honestly, the first time I saw this movie a couple years back, I'm like, holy crap, it's like no Western filmmaker, I don't think, and this is probably, this is a generalization, I'm sure somebody might, but I'm just saying you wouldn't see a Western filmmaker making a movie like this and have it succeed in, just in spades. It's really, really great. Now, I can understand why this movie is pretty much universally adored. I have seen a couple people that didn't really care for it, but not that many. Most people, and if you actually really sort of let yourself get immersed in this film, because you really kind of do have to, it almost has this very strange incantation sort of power to it. And you know, which is a good thing. It really just kind of like sucks you in and just kind of like takes you on this journey, and you're never really entirely sure where it's going. And like a lot of South Korean horror cinema and revenge cinema, it has a lot of emotion at its core, a lot of emotional tragedy, family tragedy, things like that. So it really does get you invested in its characters and sympathizing with its characters. So you really, you know, you really get emotionally invested in the bad things that are happening to them. But it's just, I will say that this movie, as I said, you need to immerse yourself in it and know going in that it's very long. It's about 2 hours and 40 minutes, I want to say, thereabouts. So it is a time commitment, and it's very long for what is ostensibly a horror film. But if you just kind of go with it and, you know, just watch it and just sort of let it do its magic on you, then there is really a lot to enjoy and a lot to recommend in it. This is also a movie that I don't think it necessarily needs 2 viewings, but I think it definitely, I mean, because I caught a lot more the second time that I watched it, because there's a lot of symbolism in there, particularly a lot of kind of like religious symbolism, not necessarily just having to do with kind of folk beliefs in, you know, this little village in Korea, but also having to do with biblical, you know, kind of stuff, biblical allusions. And I kind of feel like you really need to kind of like see it a couple times to pick up on everything that's going on in there, because the story in this is very complex. And you really kind of have to you really do have to pay attention to kind of what's going on and all the conversations and stuff like that, because there's a lot of moving parts. But I mean, I do think it's really a very, very rewarding film if you are willing to, you know, go to it. You know what I'm saying? So what we have in this film, which, as I said, I mean, one, it looks fucking beautiful. The cinematography is beautiful of this like little village and these like mountains, and everything about it is just, the whole thing has like just an atmosphere of dread to it. Now, I think I've read that this took actually 6 months to shoot, and mostly because they wanted natural light, pretty much for everything, natural light, natural weather. So whenever they had a scene that called for example, you know, like a really bad, you know, lightning storm or rainstorm, then they would actually wait for that to happen. You know what I mean? So instead of like just spraying the actors with a hose or whatever, they actually wanted everything to be like as, you know, all the weather and the lighting and stuff like that to be as natural as possible. So sometimes they just kind of had to take stuff as they could do it. And the attention to detail, the attention to the craft of filmmaking is really, really evident in the whole thing. And it just has this kind of spiraling, it's kind of going down, because as I said, it starts out almost kind of like funny, almost kind of like going into, I don't know if I'd call the beginning a straight up comedy, but it definitely is kind of like has a lot of dark comedy elements at the beginning. And it does even have some parts that are almost kind of like goofy. But then as it goes on, it just starts getting more and more grim and like darker and darker and darker, until at the end it is like absolutely not funny at all. And it's just like, it's just horrific. So, I mean, the fact that he was able to pull that off and that it's this cohesive movie is just kind of amazing. So what you have at the beginning is there is a police officer named Jong-gu, and he's like the main character. Now, Jong-gu, he's a sympathetic character, but he's not real sympathetic at the beginning, because he seems like he's kind of chubby, he's kind of lazy, he's a cop, but when he gets called to scenes, he's very cowardly, like he doesn't want to deal with it. He seems very, very out of his depth, and he kind of seems a little bit like an idiot. So that's where kind of a lot of the humor stems from, is that it's obvious that the cops in this little bitty town, when really bad shit starts happening in the town, they are absolutely not equipped to deal with it, because they're kind of morons, or they're just kind of like not used to this, or they don't even want to deal with it. So that's his character. No, he's got a wife and a mother-in-law and a little bitty daughter named Hyo-jin, who, you know, becomes a large focus of the plot later on. And actually there is a really nice kind of burgeoning relationship, or not burgeoning, but you know what I mean? There's a really good kind of sweet relationship between father and son, or father and daughter rather, even though he's not a bad father. He's just kind of like a schlub, you know what I mean? He's just kind of like a schlubby, clueless type of dude who's just kind of like going through the motions and not getting all too involved in things. He's not super ambitious. He's not super smart. He's not, he's just living in this small town with his family and just kind of shuffling around, living his life and not really like appreciating much of anything. But he's not a bad guy at heart. So very near the beginning of the movie, he gets called to this scene, which you can tell that none of the cops in this town have ever seen anything like this before. They all know this guy. He's a local ginseng farmer. And it appears that this guy has pretty much slaughtered his whole entire family. Now, the guy that did it is just sitting on the porch of the house, and he looks like a zombie, essentially. He's all covered with these fucking boils. His eyes are all whited over. He's all like spaced out. They can't get any information out of him. And he has just slaughtered like his whole entire family. It's just gore everywhere. So the cops are obviously flabbergasted and have no idea what to make of all this. And, it's kind of like the cops are sort of like, well, maybe it's, he ate some bad mushrooms or something and it made him like, trip the fuck out. And, some of them, they say that they kind of print that in the media, like to sort of, get the media off their back or whatever. But some of the cops are like, no, I don't think so. And then, the stuff starts to circulate about this stranger who moved into the village not too long prior. He's a fisherman and he's Japanese. Now, they never do say what his name is. Everybody in the movie just calls him the Jap. So you never do find out what the dude's name is. And so he's this fisherman. He's a stranger. And, there's kind of like still some tension, I guess, between the Koreans and the Japanese. So like xenophobia kind of like adds into it, too. And all these people kind of like tell the cops all these different stories about this Japanese man where they're just kind of like, oh, he raped a woman down by the river. This one guy who was like a hunter, he had like caught a deer and he fell and he hit his head. And then when he woke up, he saw what he thought was this Japanese man like naked except for this diaper loincloth situation, and he was eating the raw deer, like he was just eating its guts out. And then when he turned toward him, his eyes were like bright red. So a lot of rumors have started to circulate about this Japanese man, and everybody thinks that maybe he's kind of like behind this weird shit that's been going on, because it's not just this ginseng farmer at the beginning who, gets killed or, is all covered with boils or whatever. Then it seems like it starts to spread throughout the village. They start seeing other people, they get these kind of boils, and then their eyes go all crazy, and then they start flipping out and, killing their whole entire families. So as the story goes on, they start to suspect that, yeah, maybe this Japanese man does have something to do with it. Jong-gu is sort of interested in the case, but he's not personally involved in it. So he's just kind of, it's like they call him to a scene. It's like he shows up late and he's just like, oh, my mother-in-law was sick, or I was sleeping, or whatever. You know what I mean? He's just kind of one of those type of schlubby dude. You know what I mean? But as the story goes on, he actually becomes more personally involved because his daughter, Hyo-jin, appears to be succumbing to whatever this thing is that's spreading throughout the village. Now, at first, you're not entirely sure what it is. At first, it's kind of like, it seems like a disease, because like it seems like it's spreading, and like I said, people start getting these symptoms like bubonic plague or something. They get like boils all over their face or all over their side or whatever. And then eventually they flip out and kill their whole family or kill themselves in really horrible ways. So at first, as I said, they're kind of thinking it's a disease. But as the time goes on, and as Hyo-jin, the little girl, starts becoming affected, so at this point, Jong-gu and his wife and mother-in-law start to suspect that maybe this is something supernatural going on, because their daughter is starting to act really, really weird. Like she's She's eating all this food, like just stuffing food in her face, food that she normally wouldn't eat, like fish. She's starting to swear at her dad, and she's kind of starting to develop some boils on her side. Jong-gu is also having nightmares about ostensibly this Japanese man with the loincloth and the red eyes and everything. So, the mother-in-law is kind of like, we need to get a shaman in here. So she asks one of the neighbors to recommend one. She's like, because I'm pretty sure this is a demon. And so everybody starts to think that the Japanese man is somehow behind this demon or whatever is taking over the village. Now, one thing that obviously leads to them thinking this too, or at least leads to them thinking that the Japanese man is behind these things, is two of the cops, Jong-gu and his partner, they get this guy, his partner's nephew, I think it is like a deacon, and he speaks some Japanese, so they take him with to translate, and they go to the Japanese man's house, like his little shack or whatever, and while they're looking around, they totally illegally, like, break in. The deacon's like, this is illegal, like, you guys shouldn't be doing it, and they're just like, fuck it, we know, it's like, because at this point, like I said, they're convinced that this dude is up to something, and there's like, they're going extra legal, you know what I mean? So they bust into the guy's house, and they find this, like, little room in the back of his house that has all of these pictures of, like, a shit ton of people. There's pictures of them alive, and then pictures of them dead, and there's pictures of them, like, from the crime scenes and stuff, and some of the people you recognize from, earlier, people that got killed in the village. And there's also a bunch of stuff that seems to, like, belong to some of the victims, and this is when Jong-gu gets really involved, because he finds in this dude's cabin, he finds a little shoe, like a little sneaker, belonging to his daughter, like it has her name in it and everything. So he starts to become convinced, yeah, this guy is, put a spell on her, or is possessing her or something like that. So they bring in the shaman, and the shaman is basically like, yeah, the Japanese man is a ghost, and he's just going around wreaking havoc. He's essentially like a demon, right? And so he's just going around, and Jong-gu is like, well, why would he pick on my daughter, like, of all people? He didn't ask about, because like I said, he didn't really get emotionally invested in this until obviously his daughter was affected. Like, prior to this, like, all the other villagers, he was just kind of like, oh, that's fucked up, you know what I mean? But he's like, well, why would this guy, like, pick on my daughter? And I mean, the shaman actually makes kind of an interesting analogy. He says, well, he's a demon. He's just like a fisherman. It's like, when you go fishing, you don't know what fish you're going to catch. You're just putting bait out there, and whoever takes it. And she's like, so he would just had some bait out there, and your daughter just happened to take it. So it was just like a random occurrence, which is kind of like freaky. So as it goes on, I really don't want to spoil this, because there's so many, like, twists and turns in this, and I think it's better if you don't really know where it's going exactly. But I will say that there's these really long sequences of, like, the shaman doing a ritual that is ostensibly supposed to be getting the demon out of the little girl. You also see the Japanese man doing his own invocations or whatever for his own nefarious purpose. And I will note too that there's another character in here lurking around, a woman in white whose name is Mumyong, which I think means no name. And she is kind of lurking around too, like, and she's saying that the Japanese man is a demon and all this other stuff. So the three of these kind of magical people are sort of going around, and it comes to a thing where the story gets more and more complex, and you're not entirely sure until pretty much the very end which of these people you can trust and which one you can't. Like, you don't really know who is the good guy or the bad guy, because they're telling Jong-gu, who is just this clueless, backwater small town policeman who has been thrust into essentially like a fight between the grander forces of good and evil, and he has no fucking idea what the hell is going on, and all he wants to do is save his daughter, and that's all he's trying to do, and he's completely out of his depth. And that, I think that's what's so tragic about this, is that, as I said, he's just like a normal working Joe who, it was just thrust into the situation. It's just forces much larger than him, and he doesn't really have any sense of, who is the good guy, who is the bad guy, because everybody, whether it's the Japanese man, whether it's the woman in white, whether it's, the shaman, they're all telling him something different. And he's, as far as like supernatural, who's the demon, what do you need to do in this situation? What's a protection? What's a curse? All this other stuff. And he doesn't really have any, context for that. He didn't believe in any of that. So he's just really he doesn't really have any defense against it because he doesn't know who's telling him the truth. And, he kind of gets manipulated, and I think that's what's kind of so sad about this, is that he really doesn't have a chance, to be honest, because he just doesn't really have any idea what the hell's going on. And as I said, these are forces much larger, much older than he's ever had to deal with. And there's just no way that he can beat them, really, because he doesn't really know what's going on. One review of this I saw that was actually made a very astute observation. I think it was Ryan Hollinger, actually, who's great. If you haven't, he's Irish dude. And he does kind of in-depth video essays about various movies. And he did one on this. And his interpretation of it, and he's not the only person. I've seen other people interpret it this way too. There are a couple different ways you could interpret it. Although I thought it was pretty straightforward, like at least toward the end, if you're kind of paying attention. But like who the demon is and who's not, like who's good and who's bad. But he was pointing out that a lot of the symbolism, a lot of the kind of stuff that's going on in it had to do with faith. And with maybe like the 7 deadly sins, he was arguing that Jong-gu, even though he's, as I said, a good guy at heart, he had committed these sins, and it was essentially him that was being punished, even though it was all these other people around him that were suffering. And I actually really did like that interpretation. Like watching it again, I mean, there's definitely a lot of Christian, like religious symbolism in this. It even starts with a Bible quote, and there's a lot of stuff about, the devil. And as I said, it's a lot about faith. There's stuff about, there's one scene like toward the very end where the woman in white makes a thing about the cock crowing 3 times, which again, kind of like a biblical reference. So it has a lot of that in it. So even though it has like a lot of kind of traditional Korean, folk magic type of stuff going into like sympathetic magic, it also has a lot of stuff about Christianity and about, a lot of biblical allusions and stuff like that too, which was really cool. But as I said, this is a wild, very, very Korean stew of a movie that just has so many elements and so many different things going on in it that you would think that it would just be this big confused mess and that it totally wouldn't work, but it completely and totally does. And it's almost kind of like miraculous. I'm not really sure how it happened, but this is an amazing film. And like I said, it's very long, so if you don't have the time commitment to like sit down and actually like immerse yourself in it, wait until you have time to do that, because you really do need to pay attention to the conversations, pay attention to the symbolism, and just pay attention to all the little nuances and, everything that's going on, because it's a much richer experience if you do that. But I mean, it's just such a great movie. And, as I said, pretty much every South Korean horror and revenge film I've seen in the past 10, 15 years has been amazing. I don't know if that's just because we're getting the best ones like over here, but I mean, I don't think I've seen a bad one. So I don't know what they're doing over there, but man, they're fucking kicking our asses in a lot of ways. I don't want to say that because there have been a lot of good, American and European ones lately too. But for some reason, there's just something about South Korean ones that they just get away with a lot of stuff that I don't think you would see a Western filmmaker even attempting. And I kind of feel like the same thing happened with something like Parasite, which even though that kind of gets slotted into being a horror movie too, that had a lot of the same kind of like dark comedy, satire kind of stuff to it too. But then it had all these other elements going on, like mystery thriller. And the South Koreans filmmakers really seem to be very, very adept at combining genres in a way that doesn't feel like tonal whiplash. So it makes their stories like much richer and much more unpredictable, because you never really know like what direction it's going to go in. And this one in particular, the Wailing, I mean, it's almost like a long invocation of its own. You know what I mean? So you really do have to like spend time with it and just let yourself go along with it. But let me know if you guys have seen it and what you thought about it. I saw it on Netflix back in, like I said, 2000. It was either late 2017 or early 2018. It's not on Netflix anymore, at least in the United States. However, if you have Amazon Prime, you can watch it on Amazon Prime for free, or I believe it's also on Tubi for free, although it will have commercials. But, you know, if you don't have Amazon Prime and want to, you know, not want to pay to watch it, then you can, by all means, watch it on Tubi. I'm not sure if Tubi works in other countries. Like, somebody let me know. But yeah, if you've seen The Wailing, let me know what you thought about it in the comments. And that will do it for this Flickers of Fear, my February folk horror kind of thing that I'm doing here. And I will see you guys on the next one. Bye.